Okay, so we are on chapter 5, and chapter 5 talks about historical foundations of U.S. education. And I'm on page 146, and I want you to highlight the first paragraph on that page. And I'm not going to read everything from there, but there are some very important points that I want to bring to your attention. One of these things that I want to bring out to your attention is one of the quotes that's at the very beginning of the paragraph, and it says, "Those that cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it." And this is very true when it comes to teaching. It goes on further to say, "For teachers, the implication of these statements are clear. The past has an impact on teaching the schools of today. Accomplished teachers learn from our nation's educational past. They know that educational practices from the past have not disappeared yet. They continue to evolve, and they shape the present as well as the future." So that kind of sets the tone for the entire chapter. It's going to go by periods of time. The first period of time is from 1620 to 1750. And before you say, well, I didn't know I was going to have to get, history in this class, you have to know the background of educational history so you can appreciate these things that we put into common practice. If you, for instance, best practices or Bloom's taxonomy, well, you need to know why we use these things. They're tried and true, and you need to know why that these are the things that you need to use and incorporate in your classroom. So we're just going to kind of go take a look in the past and bring it up to the future, or for this book's purpose, it'll be to the 2000s, which will take us up to now. Okay, so what were teaching in schools like in the American colonies? All right, so when I think about the American colonies, remember there weren't 50 states at that time. So you have to think about pre-Revolutionary War. Okay, people coming from over in England, fleeing. I'm sorry, the yoke of the British rule, having to have a king say, you do this, you do that, you do this, and you do that. Well, they didn't want to do that, so they fled. Okay, and a lot of them were fleeing for various religious reasons. And one of the key things that I want you to remember about the early schools was that there was no separation of church and state. Let me repeat that. In early schools, there was no separation of church and state. I know it's totally different now. Okay, you're not really even supposed to have a Bible out in clear view. Okay, and if it is in clear view, you're really not supposed to have it open, because we have these laws of church separation of church and state being the school. But back in colonial era, that was not the case. They were very much interrelated. In fact, you're about to find out that reading and writing was mainly to help students to read the Bible. So they were very much interrelated. Okay, so I want you to highlight the section under, and this is still on page 146, what we're teaching in schools like in the colonial American colonies, 1620 to 1750. And it talks about how education in colonial America had its primary roots in the English culture, which means that settlers from our country initially tried to develop a system of schooling that paralleled to the British two-track system. If students were from lower classes, let me see, I'm going to make sure I'm reading that right. If students from the lower classes attended school at all, it was at the elementary level. And at the elementary level, they received practical skills in reading, writing, and computation, also receiving religious instruction. Schools from the upper classes had an opportunity to attend what was called Latin grammar schools. And from these schools, when you left these schools, you were prepared to go on to college. So these were your college prep schools. And they focused on subjects such as Latin and Greek classics. Above all, the colonial curriculum stressed religious objectives. Generally, there was no distinction made between the secular that means the outside world, and religious life in the colonies. Okay. The primary objective of elementary schooling was to learn to read so one might read the Bible, okay, and thereby receive salvation. So on page 147 at the bottom, I highlighted that whole section about the status of teachers, and it goes on to page 148. And what you need to know is that back in the day, there weren't many qualifications. You know, you have all these qualifications now to become a teacher, but back then in the colonial schools, you could do so with minimum qualifications. Also, there was little pay, and the status, that means that your stature in the community was relatively low. Respect increased with grade level and the amount of education required for the position. Hence, elementary school teachers, the majority of whom only had elementary education themselves, they were given the least amount of respect. And then teachers in few secondary schools accorded the highest status because there were far and few in between. Okay. Now you have to keep in mind the you had church and you had work, you had farming, and farming and being a member of the clergy were the highest things that you could do in the day, okay, highest occupations. It says here, because teachers and members of the clergy were educated, they were special. So even though teachers did have a low status compared to clergy and the farmers, they still enjoyed they were still special, okay, because they did have some sort of education. But they were also expected to have high moral character. When I talked about how preachers and teachers were very similar, I was not just joking. I was really meaning that, and it's related back to history. Um, on the other hand, teachers were shadowed because they were subordinate to the clergy. So they were actually, you know, they had to report to them. Okay, so clergy were here, and then here are your teachers. All right. It says that the clergy were the power elite in the community, and teachers' extra duties reflected this marginal status. For instance, teachers rang the church bells, swept up, taught Bible lessons, and occasionally substituted for the ailing pastor. And of course, this is no big revelation. Males were considered to be, you know, the desired teacher. It says here, and although males were preferred as teachers, in the summer months when men needed to work the land, women were recruited to take their place. And in fact, that is the origin of summer vacation, because you went to school and you had to be out in the summer to help in the farm, to harvest, things of that nature. Colonial schools, I highlighted the first paragraph there in its entirety, and then I highlighted in the second paragraph the first two sentences. And at the bottom of the page, I highlighted that entire paragraph onto page 149, which gives you a definition of parochial schools. And you know, we still have parochial schools today. In New England colonies, which were Massachusetts Bay, New Hampshire, and Connecticut, there was a general consensus that church, state, and schools were interrelated. As a result, town schools were created through the colonies to teach children the basics of reading and writing so they could learn scriptures. These schools were heavily influenced by the Puritans, a group of Protestants who believed in strict religious discipline and simplified religious ceremonies. So the Puritan view of the child included a belief that people were inherently evil, and even natural childhood play was seen as devil-inspired idleness. So they were very strict. Going down to the next part that I highlighted, the middle colonies were considered New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and Delaware. They were more diverse. They had more people in them from various areas such as Irish, Scots, Swedes, Danes, Dutch, and Germans. And they established the parochial schools based on their religious belief. And it goes on to say that Anglicans, Lutherans, Quakers, Jews, Catholics, Presbyterians, and even Mennonites in the middle colonies tended to establish their own schools. So your religious groups were really responsible for establishing schools back in the day. In largely Protestant southern colonies, and those included the the states of Virginia, Maryland, Georgia, and North and South Carolina. Wealthy plantation owners believed the purpose of education was to promote religion and to prepare their children to attend colleges and universities in Europe. And the vast of small farmers received no formal education. Their children, and the children of African slaves received only training that they needed to serve their masters. So no one type of schooling was common to all the colonies, but this was about to change. And you're going to hear more about the establishment of the common school movement and what that meant. But for the meantime, the most common types, you had three. You had dame schools, you had reading and writing schools, and you had Latin grammar schools. So the first one on page 149, actually all of them are on page 149, the dame schools kind of were established for girls, but boys did go to dame schools, and it says that dame schools provided initial instruction for boys, but it was often the only school for girls at the time. These schools were run by widows or housewives in their homes, where the primary classroom was in the kitchen, and that's probably because it was probably the warmest room in the house. And where children only learn the barest essentials of reading, writing, and arithmetic. And this only lasted a few weeks to 1 year. Females were also taught the basics of sewing and homemaking. Reading and writing schools was the next type of school, and only boys went to this school. Girls stopped at the dame schools. So reading and writing schools, boys received an education that went far beyond what their parents could teach them or what they could learn at a dame school. Reading lessons were based on the Bible and the New England Primer, which was first printed in 1690. And it has an example, if you'll look on page 149, of kind of what the New England Primer had printed in it. Latin grammar schools was the third school that was mentioned, and I highlighted where in the first paragraph where you see Latin grammar school, and that is bolded, and I highlighted from that sentence on down to the end of the paragraph, and it says that Latin grammar schools were comparable to the secondary schooling system of today. It was patterned after the classical schools in Europe. Boys enrolled in Latin grammar schools at the age of 7 and 8. So you have to keep in mind that boys were considered men at a very young age. So their schooling had to take place early, or what we would consider to be early. Whereupon they began to prepare to enter Harvard College. And Harvard College, of course, Harvard University, was established in 1636. And following graduation from Harvard, they would assume leadership roles in the church. So again, the establishment of schools by religious groups was so they could come back and lead congregations, to be preachers. Okay. It goes on to say that Latin and Greek were principal studies in these schools, though arithmetic was introduced in 1745. Students were required to read Latin authors and speak Latin in poetry and prose, as well as conjugate Greek verbs. Okay. Typical Latin grammar school, the course of study lasted for 7 years. Apparently, school was in session 6 days a week and continued throughout the winter and the summer. The school day was usually from 6 to 11 in the morning and from 1 to 4 or 5 o'clock in the afternoon. Okay, so that's what it was like to go there. And some school regulations designated the punishments which were carried out against fighting, lying, cursing, even playing cards or dice. And it goes on to talk about schools for African Americans and Native Americans. Very small paragraph, so I highlighted all of that. It says one of the first schools for African and Native Americans was started by Elias New in New York City in 1704. New was a person who spoke out against slavery and the lack of education for the children of slaves. And here we go with the church. And when he asked the Church of England to provide teachers, church leaders appointed him to teach African Americans and Native Americans how to read as part of the church's effort to convert students. So there was underlying motive. All right. Now, did you ever wonder why, and you may not have wondered, but if you become a teacher one day and your student is like, well, why do I have to go to school? And you say, well, because it's a law. Well, here's the beginning of that. Here's the origin of mandated education. And that is on page 150. And I highlighted the first two paragraphs. And it says that universal compulsory education had its roots or origins in the Massachusetts Act of 1642. This is viewed by some historians as the first school law in the colonies. Prior to this date, parents could decide whether they wish their children could be educated at home or at school. So church and civic leaders in colonies, however, decided that education could no longer be mandatory. They saw that children were receiving inadequate occupational training. So moreover, they realized the organization of schools would serve to strengthen and preserve Puritan religious beliefs. So I went down, skipped 2 paragraphs and highlighted the last paragraph on page 150, and it talks about the Massachusetts Act of 1647, which is referred to as the Old Deluder Satan Act. And it says, in particular, towns of 50 households or more were to appoint a person to instruct all such children all such children as shall resort to him to read and write. Teachers were either paid by parents or masters in the required towns or by inhabitants in general. This act also required towns of 100 households or more to establish a Latin grammar school to prepare the students for Harvard College. So if they had 50 households, they had to have some type of little elementary school. And if they had 100 or more, they had to have the elementary and the secondary school, which was the Latin grammar school. It says that a town that failed to satisfy the law could be assessed a fine of £5. Okay. So what were the goals of education during the Revolutionary period from 1750 to 1820? All right. Well, I kind of skipped over all the way over to, it talked about Ben Franklin's Academy and Thomas Jefferson's philosophy, but I wanted to bring across one thing about female education. It says that some women were enrolled in female seminaries, the first established in the early 19th century to train women for higher ed and public service outside the home. So this is where women got an opportunity to get past the dame schools that they had. So I thought that was noteworthy to know. Skip on over to page 154, which picks back up on what happened after Elias New, education for African Americans and Native Americans. There were other schools that were also established, and a group called the Quakers started schools for African and Native Americans, and I highlighted under that section the second paragraph. It says one of the best known schools for African Americans was founded in Philadelphia by Anthony Benezet, who believed that African Americans were generally sensible, humane, and social, and that their capacity is as good and as capable of improvement that is of white people. So you had to keep in mind the mindset was that African Americans were savages. So that's why this was said there. How was and this is another section, how was the struggle won for state-supported common schools? So here we go with the common school movement. Okay, the first thing I want you to know is that Horace Mann established the common school genre or movement, and on page 155 I just want you to know that he was a lawyer, a Massachusetts senator, and the first secretary of a state board of education. He is best known as the champion of the common school movement, which led to free, public, locally controlled elementary schools as we know today. So this is very, very noteworthy. Common schools tended to be schools that taught common themes. Okay? Because you had all these different religious groups that were establishing their schools. So we're going to pick back there up on the next video.